লাইভ করে দিয়েছি। না, ভিডিওটা এখনো আসেনি। রিফ্রেশ করি। এটা চলে এসছে লাইভে, আমি জাস্ট পাবলিক করে দিচ্ছি এটাকে। এত মানে ল্যাগিং হচ্ছে না। এডিট অডিয়েন্স। Good evening, everyone. We come to yet another guest talk session organized by Litinfinite Journal. Today we have Dr. Samik Sen with us, who will be speaking on ideological motivations of Shakespeare criticism in Bengal. We welcome Dr. Sen to today's guest talk session. Dr. Samik Sen teaches in the Department of English in Nobo Barakpur Profullo Chandra Mahavidyalaya, affiliated to West Bengal State University. He did his graduation from Presidency College, Kolkata, and his post-graduation from Calcutta University. He was awarded PhD from Aurobindo Bharati University. He has taught as guest faculty in West Bengal State University, in Sanskrit College and University. He has published both in English and in Bangla. A passionate academic and a literary critic with a creative bent of mind, he believes in the social commitment of scholarship. Apart from critical writings, he indulges in poetic exercises and has already published 5 collections of poems in Bangla. So it's over to you now, sir, for today's guest talk session.
Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to thank Litinfinite, especially Professor Sritonni Chakraborty, for inviting me, for giving me this opportunity to share some thoughts and ideas with you. Basically, what I would like to do today is to give you an outline of my critical engagements and negotiations with Shakespeare criticism in Bengal. This was my this was the topic of my PhD dissertation, and I'm happy to inform you that now this thesis has become a book. It is published by Author Press, and it is available on Amazon. Now, at the very outset, I would like to make clear that I am not going to offer a narrative to trace the historical evolution of Shakespeare criticism in Bengal. This is not a kind of historical review of the critical responses to Shakespeare that was produced in Bengal by some extraordinary scholars, critics, and teachers. Rather, I would like to, or rather I would try to delve deeper into the presuppositions, into the assumptions, into the ideological motivations that have conditioned the production of Shakespeare criticism in Bengal. I am particularly indebted for my theoretical framework to some of the noted and eminent Western theorists and thinkers like Terry Eagleton, Pierre Michere, Louis Althusser. In fact, my reading of these thinkers has actually inspired me to construct a theoretical framework which or rather using that theoretical framework, I have tried to I don't know whether I have succeeded or not, but I have tried to find out the ideological motivations behind the Shakespeare criticism produced in Bengal. Criticism, as the eminent Marxist critic Terry Eagleton has suggested, is not a politically innocent discipline. It is not a disinterested pursuit, an objective pursuit of knowledge, truth, blah, 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 whatever we associate criticism with. And criticism, according to Terry Eagleton, it is not a spontaneous riposte uh, to the existential fact of the text. And Eagleton says, in fact, this contention has helped me a lot. In fact, this contention of Eagleton has inspired me to think alternatively. Eagleton says that criticism emerges into existence and passes out of it under certain determinate conditions. We have to understand this first, because traditionally literary criticism has been viewed as an interpretative activity which is subservient to, even parasitic on, literary creations or creative functions of literature. When English was established as an academic discipline in the British universities, criticism played a relatively minor part in it. The noted Oxford academic, I remember Helen Gardner, she authored a book entitled The Business of Criticism, which was published in 1959. There, Helen Gardner has viewed criticism as the function of criticism as elucidatory, illuminating, rather than evaluative. Okay. And what is implicit in these conceptions of criticism is the assumption that criticism, that the function of criticism is basically interpretative. So the task of the critique is to make the meaning of literature accessible to the audience. So the critic is like an intermediate link. He is a kind of mediator, arbitrator between the meaning of the text, okay, which is somehow mysteriously, which is involved in mystery and which is inaccessible to the laity. So the critique, he is almost like the deputy of the author, like a representative of the author. He is trying to make the meaning of literary artifacts accessible to the readers. This is the traditional conception of criticism. But the tectonic shift that theory, so-called theory revolution, brought in the domain of literary studies, that somehow has challenged this traditional conception of criticism. And that has made, this theory revolution has made it possible to recognize the fact that the supposedly innocuous, politically innocent and politically innocuous activity of criticism is actually a social practice, a socio-political practice. Okay, and somehow or other, it is not at all a disinterested pursuit, rather an intellectual exercise which is ideologically motivated, which is conditioned by the ideological affiliations of the critic. Ideology, as we all know, it is basically, let us make it simple, it is basically a view. It signifies what a group or a community of people takes to be natural and self-evident. So when I say that there are certain ideological motivations behind the Shakespeare criticism produced in Bengal, I I intend to convey this view to all of you that uh, I personally feel I have tried to explore this particular aspect in my thesis, that when the critic is responding in a particular way, any critic, to Shakespearean texts, he is motivated, he is conditioned by certain ideological allegiances. Now, as I have already said, that this is not a historical overview. It's not a narrative that tries to historically, explore or examine the Shakespeare criticism produced in Bengal. Rather, it's a very critical, very analytical, from an analytical perspective, I have tried to look at this particular, uh, aspect of Shakespeare criticism. Now, the relationship between Shakespeare and Bengal has a long history. It goes back to the introduction of uh, Western education in Bengal in the 19th century, and the consequent exposure of the people of Bengal to the charm, inexhaustible charm, enthralling, fascinating charm of English literature. And I would like to quote from a very important book, important as well as very provocative, uh, Autobiography of an Unknown Indian by Mirotsi Chaudhuri. I would like to quote from that particular book. He says, I do not know if any other country or people in the world has ever made one author the epitome, test, and symbol of literary culture as we Bengalis did with Shakespeare in the 19th century. So, Shakespeare uh, managed to colonize the imagination of the Bengalis more effectively and enduringly. Now, the inception of Shakespeare criticism, in inception of Shakespeare study in Bengal, as I have already said, it is connected with the beginning of colonial education. Gauri Vishwanathan's very influential book, Masks of Conquest, uh, published in 1989, that has contended that the British administration in India somehow exploited the aesthetic and the emotional appeal of English literature uh, to contain the anticipated threat of native insurrection. Now, here we come to a very interesting phenomenon. Shakespeare is presented, he is projected as a transcendental genius, that is, an artist, a creative genius whose genius has transcended the historical vicissitudes. He is timeless. The timelessness of Shakespeare is emphasized, it is foregrounded by the colonial educators or the colonial administration. Obviously, it has some political purpose, we all know that, because the mission of the colonial administration was to create uh, a comprador class. We know Macaulay's infamous minute, and how Macaulay emphasized the production, the necessity of producing a group of people who will be culturally uh, enlightened, and in spite of their brown skin, they will subscribe to the Western ideologies. Okay, so that was basically the objective of colonial education. Shakespeare plays a very important role, a very crucial role in this colonial policy. because Shakespeare is projected as, the universality of Shakespeare, that is repeatedly emphasized, that is repeatedly foregrounded. Now, this is absolutely a colonial strategy. But how did the colonized respond to it? Let me refer to Bankim Chandra Chatterjee's uh, essay, Confessions of uh, a Young Bengal. In that particular essay, he Bankim Chandra, we all know, he's praised as well as criticized as the founder, the father of Hindu nationalism. But Bankim Chandra uh, enunciated without any kind of qualms, without any kind of hesitation, that uh, Shakespeare is the immortal poet of universal human nature. Immortal poet of universal human nature. Universal human nature is a very problematic, a very complex idea. Because I have already said that universality of Shakespeare, the transcendental genius of Shakespeare, that was emphasized by the colonial administration. So the colonial administration actually wants the colonized intelligentsia to accept, to acknowledge the universality of Shakespeare. And in the response of the colonized intelligentsia, that universality is acknowledged. So mission is fulfilled. The colonial mission is accomplished. Okay. And interestingly, those nationalists who uh, rebelled against the administrative policies of the British colonial, rulers, they uh, were enthralled, they were enchanted by Shakespeare. So somehow or other, for example, I can refer to uh, Tagore's ambiguous and ambivalent response to this. He said there are two kinds of Englishmen. He says Boro Ingrej and Choto Ingrej. In fact, Tagore has confessed, Tagore has expressed his doubt regarding this. He says, I don't understand when I look at these people, these Englishmen who are exploiting us. Okay, uh, how can they produce such a rich culture? I mean, Tagore said, did Shakespeare, Wordsworth, Shelley belong or came from the same culture? This ambiguity, this ambivalence in the response of the colonized to Shakespeare was very important as well as a very crucial element. Okay, we need to understand this particular ambiguity in order to understand the inception of Shakespeare criticism in Bengal. Uh, Partho Chattopadhyay, in his Nation and its Fragments, he has made a very important observation. I would like to sum it up for you. I won't quote from Partho Chatterjee's book, but this is Partho Chatterjee's insight. He said that for the colonized intelligentsia, for the Calcutta middle class of the 19th century, the political and the economic domination by a British colonial uh, system was a fact. Okay, because you see, this class was created in a relation of subordination. They accepted this, but they tried to contest this relation of subordination, uh, claiming its cultural leadership of the indigenous colonized people. Somehow, I remember, but I don't remember the source. I read in one of the uh, plays produced in 19th century Bengal. There, a character, a housewife, she says, "Jai ekটু Shakespeare পড়ে আসি." So Shakespeare somehow, that was, like a car, as if a new car. Your knowledge of Shakespeare is something that you can flaunt, that you can boast of. Now, from this, we move on to Sri Aurobindo. We don't have much time. I'm trying to, in a way, I'm trying to condense because it will take a lot of time. Uh, Sri Aurobindo, somehow, he is the first Indian critic who tried to Indianize Shakespeare. Basically, in his future poetry, obviously, in many other critical essays, Aurobindo uh, has acknowledged uh, his date to Shakespeare. We should not forget Aurobindo himself was a poet, uh, and he said that he rather tried to nationalize, he tried to Indianize Shakespeare. How? Aurobindo in the future poetry, uh, he insists on, he's speaking of Shakespeare's insistence on, uh, not on in externalized action, but on inner action. So Aurobindo, in a way, distinguishes between external action and internal action, and he refers to Virat and Hiranyagarbha. Okay, these are two terms that Aurobindo uh, used from the Indian mythology, Hindu mythology more precisely. Uh, he compares Shakespeare, Aurobindo compares Shakespeare with Hiranyagarbha. What does he say? He says that Shakespeare's is not a drama of mere externalized action. It lives from within and more deeply than uh, the external life. And he says that this is not Virat, the seer and the creator of gross form, but Hiranyagarbha, the luminous mind of dreams, looking through those forms to see his own images behind it. And then Aurobindo ventures to compare Shakespeare to the sage Vishwamitra. Vishwamitra, he created a new world. Aurobindo said that Shakespeare also created a world which is absolutely independent, which is absolutely autonomous. Okay, so what exactly Aurobindo is trying to do? He is trying to dismantle the very idea of criticism as an objective and disinterested pursuit of truth, of the meaning in a literary text. And in fact, Aurobindo is a very ambitious critic, I think, because Aurobindo, at that point of time, psychoanalytic criticism was very much in vogue. And Aurobindo, uh, he has tried to emphasize that he in fact derided the reductive tendencies in the Western criticism, because he said that the psychoanalytic research will not be able to will not be able to grasp the meaning of Shakespeare, reducing Shakespeare's creations to the chemistry of body or mind. Okay. Um, Now, while Aurobindo's encounter with Shakespearean canon that allowed ample space for the play of creative imagination and subjective evaluation, the academic criticism of Shakespeare that flourished in Bengal, that flourished under the influence of the critical models widely prevalent in uh, the West. In my thesis, I have dealt with three luminaries, Subodh Chandra Sengupta, Amol Bhattacharjee, and Taraknath Sen. Uh, all three, they were teachers. They professionally they were teachers. Now they had an academic commitment. They were pedagogues. So, like Aurobindo, they could not take any liberty. So they ultimately subscribed to the Western critical model. Okay, and in a way, I think Aurobindo has. I mean, sorry, these three teachers, they somehow, uh, from the amateuristic outlook of man of letters, they, you know, uh, they moved on to a systematic approach because for them the professional obligation was greater than any subjective evaluation of Shakespeare. Okay, so I don't have the time, but let me give you an example. For example, Subodh Chandra Sengupta in Shakespearean tragedy and in Shakespearean comedy, he is talking of Shakespeare, or rather Shakespeare's creations, from an academic point of view. And his main objective is to make the meaning of Shakespeare's creations accessible to the students. Now, this is another problematic idea. Why? Because what does meaning of literary text mean? What is the meaning of meaning? This is something which is very important. Who is creating the meaning? Is the meaning inherent in the text? Somehow, all these academic critics, they considered meaning as an intrinsic property, as if it is inherent in the literary text. And the task of the critic is to unearth it, as if the critic is trying to exhume, he's trying to, in a way, dig up the meaning. This is a very important aspect of, Shakespeare criticism that flourished in the Indian academy. Then uh, in the third chapter of my book, I have dealt with two important critics. One is Jagannath Chakraborty and another is Shukanto Chaudhuri. And I have tried to show how these critics, even these critics, they were also, reared up in the academic tradition, in the tradition of academic criticism. Okay, but somehow, instead of conforming slavishly, instead of subscribing slavishly to the academic tradition, they are trying to, in a way, they are trying to find out some alternative ways. For example, in Shukanto Chaudhuri's Infirm Glory, Shukanto Chaudhuri is trying to revise the historicist position, okay, of Shakespeare criticism. Jagannath Chakraborty, he is using the existentialist philosophy for understanding King Lear. Okay, and when these critics are using their uh, their different ways of interpretation, their different perspectives, somehow they are operating, they are functioning inside the academy, but at the same time they are revising, they are modifying. In a way, they are bringing certain changes in the perspective. Okay. Then the last chapter of my book that deals with two materialist critics of Shakespeare in Bengal. One is Utpal Datta, Shakespeare's সমাজ চেতনা, Shakespeare's societal consciousness. Another is Shorbani Choudhury. Interestingly, it's a very, a very strange combination, because Utpal Datta, he did not belong to the academy. Shorbani Choudhury, she was a teacher professionally. Now, both of them are approaching Shakespeare from a Marxist point of view, from a materialist point of view. But while Utpal Datta approaches Shakespeare from the point of view of a traditional Marxist, maybe a Stalinist, I will come to this. Shorbani Choudhury is, she's approaching Shakespeare from a new historicist or cultural materialist perspective. So Shorbani Choudhury's thesis on Shakespeare represents some later developments of Marxist literary criticism. We should not forget that, in fact, new historicism, cultural materialism, these are all developments of Marxist literary criticism. Now, Utpal Datta's Shakespeare's সমাজ চেতনা, that was published in the politically turbulent Bengal of 1970s, and it was evidently intended to be a radical riposte to the traditional criticism of Shakespeare in Bengal. But Utpal Datta has not only reacted against the so-called bourgeois interpretation of Shakespeare, he has also reacted against the so-called pro-Marxist, or rather the Bolshevik criticism of Shakespeare. For example, he refers to Lunacharsky, he refers to some other Russian critics. These Russian critics, they wanted to represent Shakespeare as the, project Shakespeare as the mouthpiece of progressive bourgeoisie. Utpal Datta, he counters this particular view, and he emphatically asserts that there can be nothing called progressive bourgeoisie. Bourgeoisie is always a decadent force in the society, and Shakespeare is basically the representative of the proletariat, not of the progressive bourgeoisie. Interestingly, when Utpal Datta published this particular text, I have already said it was a politically turbulent Bengal, and a lot of ideological conflicts were going on inside the Communist Party. As we all know, there was a Peking bloc, there was the Russian, the Moscow bloc. Okay, some communists, they towed the ideological line of Russia. Some subscribed to the Chinese line. Utpal Datta, he was, at that point of time, he subscribed to the much more radical Chinese view or Chinese line. Okay, the ideology of Mao Zedong. And Utpal Datta criticized his comrades who subscribed to the Moscow line as revisionist. At that point of time, these revisionists, the so-called revisionist, Marxists, they championed, they embraced a very, a line of compromise with some of the liberal, some of the progressive elements of the bourgeoisie. Okay. On the other hand, Mao Zedong, he clearly attacked this particular attitude as revisionist. So Utpal Datta, when he says that Shakespeare is not the representative of the progressive bourgeoisie, because there is nothing called progressive bourgeoisie. The progressive bourgeoisie, basically, it's an oxymoron. Okay, you cannot place the adjective progressive before the bourgeoisie. So here Utpal Datta is basically subscribing to a much more radical political ideology. Shormani Chaudhuri, on the other hand, as I have already said, unlike Utpal Datta, she was an academic. Okay, so naturally, the major intent of her work, as the critic herself has asserted, she says that it is to reread the glittering world of the Renaissance England, where the monolithic icon of the absolute prince imposes a natural, spontaneous cohesion in society. So, when Shorbani Chaudhuri is reacting against the so-called traditional criticism of Shakespeare, she is, she looks at this particular, she looks at this particular idea from the cultural materialist, from the new historicist perspective. I will conclude referring to Louis Althusser. Louis Althusser has formulated a distinction between two kinds of reading. And I think this formulation can be effectively employed to illuminate the difference between the critical approaches of these two Marxist critics. How Althusser distinguishes between two kinds of critical reading with reference to Marx's encounter with the texts of his predecessors. In one kind of reading, the critic contains that some meanings are intrinsic to the text under scrutiny, but the previous critics, they could not find out this meaning. Okay, the meaning was there. As Utpal Datta says, Shakespeare was a proletarian artist. So the social message, the political message, it was there in Shakespeare's texts. But unfortunately, the traditional bourgeois critics, they could not find out this meaning. So Utpal Datta is charging these bourgeois critics of oversight. But in another kind of reading, Louis Althusser says, he says that the critic criticizes the earlier commentators for not having understood what they have seen. So he is not charging them of oversight. He says that they have seen, they have not overlooked, but they have not understood what they have seen. Shorbani Chaudhuri, when she is criticizing the traditional bourgeois critics of Shakespeare, Shorbani Chaudhuri is actually subscribing to this kind of reading as mentioned by Louis Althusser. So this all I have to say. Now this session is open for questions.
Thank you so much, sir, for such an enriching session that we had. We have comments here. We also have questions that are for the session. Questions have come. So this is one question that we have. This is via WhatsApp by Mr. Avijit Bhadra. And Avijit has asked, what are some of the problems with editing Shakespearean writing in Indian languages?
Basically, this was not my area. This is
Hmm.
something I think this doesn't pertain to my research. Obviously,
Okay.
there are some problems. I think
Yes,
the
of
main
course.
problem, yeah, the main problem is to relocate Shakespeare or other Shakespearean writing in Indian languages. But at the same time, I do feel that Shakespeare offers us, an opportunity, because we have seen that in Bollywood, so many good films have been made. Uh, for example, Omkara, for example, Haider, for example, Makbul. So there are problems, but at the same time, there are opportunities also, I think.
We have one more question. This is also from Shuchetana Vishwas. She has talked about how we all know Kalidas as the Indian Shakespeare. So, can we somehow merge the essence of Kalidasa and Shakespeare from the perspective of rasa theory? I think that's
Yeah.
not exactly
No,
related to what today's
exactly,
topic was, but
but
still, if you
yes,
can
yes.
kindly address
Yes,
it.
I
Yes.
yes, I would like to mention something. Once again, I will refer to Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo, in one of his essays, he started comparing Kalidasa and Shakespeare. But then he said that no, they cannot be compared, because Kalidasa belonged to an absolutely different culture. In fact, interestingly, Aurobindo is talking of cultural nationalism in the 19th
Right.
century. In fact, this idea was once again taken from Schlegel, from many romantic theorists, German romantic theorists, the concept of Volksgeist. And he said that every nation has a different unconscious, a different racial unconscious. And in fact, Aurobindo went on in that particular essay that I have referred to. He went on. He was, in spite of being the champion of cultural nationalism, Aurobindo went on to glorify Shakespeare at the expense of Kalidasa. And he said, no, Kalidasa, obviously, Kalidasa is the poet of Shanta Rasa. That is what Aurobindo said, the divine tenderness. That was the expression that Aurobindo used. But Aurobindo at the same time said that Kalidasa has not been able to produce a tragedy, a Shakespearean tragedy, because Shakespeare belonged to a different culture, and therefore he came from a different racial unconscious.
Absolutely. I think Shujatana has already received the answer for her question. So, till now, we are having these two questions, and of course, we are having numerous comments. We have from Nilanjana Mitra. She's saying it's unique and enriching. Thank you, Nilanjana. We have a comment from Kunal Roy, wonderful and unique. Thank you. I think, in fact, I was just, while the show was going on, I remembered that you had a paper this time in the Litinfinite, the current issue of the journal, since you are talking about the biographical
Yes.
criticism of Shakespeare in Bengal. So
In fact,
it
there
also in,
also, yeah,
yes, you
there
mentioned
also
about this.
Yeah, there also I have tried to
Hmm.
examine the ideological motivation behind biographical criticism. Basically, I have not tried to say what the critics have said about Shakespeare. I have tried to examine why a particular critic reads Shakespeare in a particular way. That is
Hmm.
my research area.
And this is very interesting since you are talking about the last chapter where you mentioned that Utpal Datta, he was of course not from this academic background that we can see, and yet he had so much to contribute in terms of delineating these aspects of Shakespearean study. So, of course, I think this chapter particularly, this is going to be of much
Yes.
interest when people are going through your book,
And
which is
yes,
available on Amazon. They can
yes,
just go through the, yes.
and see, when Utpal Datta, this is also a very, and I think another interesting idea which I
Hmm.
would like to share with my audience. See, when Utpal Datta is reading Shakespeare, is he only reading Shakespeare, or is he reading the contemporary political climate? Don't you think that when a particular critic is reading Shakespeare, he is also
Hmm.
reading, not only reading Shakespeare's times, but also reading his own time? Because he is located,
Absolutely.
he is historically situated. That is my contention, that a critic, he is not born out of nothing. A critic is conditioned historically. He is historically situated. So when Utpal Datta is countering the ideologies of his opponents inside the party, he is
Hmm.
using Shakespeare in order to substantiate his arguments. So don't you think that Shakespeare is being employed by the critics in order
Hmm.
to substantiate the ideology to which that particular critic subscribes?
Right, absolutely. I just, before we come to almost wrapping up the entire session, I have one question. In any case,
Yes.
from the academic perspective, do we think that there is this overusability of, employing Shakespeare as a part of different studies? In that case, how do we see the future? I mean, too much of using in case of different aspects of criticism. In any case, is this very conscious effort on part of critics? Because Shakespeare, as we know from the perspective of salability, if we say that it's a very cunning device on the part of the critics. So can we say from that angle also, why Shakespeare? Why this biographical criticism? Since
No,
you
I think,
talked about
yes,
universality, I would
yes,
definitely
yes.
like to pose this question.
But don't you think, I agree with you, but don't you think that Shakespeare is still our contemporary? As I am, we have seen that is Shakespeare our contemporary? That was the
Mm-hmm.
title of a famous book. But the
Hmm.
point is, Shakespeare is being used by those in power, and Shakespeare is being used by those who are not in power. This is the
Right,
universality of Shakespeare.
right.
Shakespeare, if you read the historical plays of Shakespeare, and if you are a royalist, if you are a conservative reader, you can substantiate your position using
Hmm.
Shakespeare. Once again, if you are a radical reader, if you
Hmm.
subscribe to the so-called Marxist ideology, if you are anti-power, if you are anti-establishment, then also you can use Shakespeare. I think herein lies the universality of Shakespeare. Shakespeare is like an empty bottle. You can fill up that bottle with your own, color, I think.
Absolutely. We have one more question here. I think this is by Professor Shubhajit Singho. I think, sir, you can see the question. I'm not reading it then. Rory Clements has a series of thrillers in
Yes, this is
Elizabethan England. Yes,
yes,
yes.
Shubhajit is absolutely right. But the point is, it is not only Rory Clements. In fact, Shakespearean scholarship. Yes, that is a very important issue raised by Shubhajit. I think Shakespeare was a very popular dramatist. We should not forget this. Who constituted Shakespeare's audience? The groundlings. Okay,
Hmm.
Shakespeare was not an art filmmaker. We should not forget this. Shakespeare was very much like David Dhawan. He knew the pulse of the common people. Unfortunately, yes, Shubhajit is absolutely right that unfortunately the edifice of the critical enterprise that we have created, that we have constructed, that is very elitist so far as
Hmm.
Shakespearean criticism is concerned. But don't you think, Shubhajit, in a way, Utpal Datta tried to break this? Because Datta did not belong to the academy. He was not an academic critic at all. So when Datta is trying to read Shakespeare in his own way, he does not bring his professional expertise. He is not talking of the form, he is not talking of the technicalities, he is not talking of the imagery. So when Dotto is writing, I mean Uppal Dotto is writing about Shakespeare, don't you think he is also trying to popularize Shakespeare in his own way? In fact, unfortunately, We don't have an Edmund Wilson in our culture. We don't have a Philip Rav in our culture. All these people in the West, they did not belong to the academy. Okay, so still they have read literature from radically, from a radically altered perspective. Unfortunately, we don't have this. Shakespeare is monopolized. I mean, the study of Shakespeare is monopolized by the academics. This is also, I think, we have to rethink. I mean, the theater critics, okay, those who are coming from some other disciplines, we need to see how do they respond to Shakespeare.
I think, sir, we can just take the last question before we finish. This is from Kunal Roy. How can Shakespearean ideological motivation be employed in the modern texts or literature of today? That
Basically, this
is
is not Shakespearean ideological motivation. My contention is reading is an ideological activity. Reading is a social practice. There is nothing called politically innocent reading. Okay, so when you are reading, however irresponsible a reader you may be, some people claim I am reading just for fun. I am reading just for pleasure. Even then, it is not an innocuous activity. Even then, it is not a disinterested activity. Reading is an ideological decipherment of an ideological text. See, the text itself is ideological because it is produced within the ideology. And when you are
right.
reading the text, that is also an ideological act. So you have to consider literature from this particular perspective.
I think that is exactly where Mr. Roy will also get this answer, because you have been discussing all those multiple layers that are associated in this reading. So thank you so much, sir. We come to almost an end of our session. And as you know that from Litinfinite, we have been organizing the guest talks. So before you go, any words of inspiration for our journal?
Litinfinite, I don't think it's it's only a journal. For me, it's an illuminating experience, very inspiring, because you see the content. For example, the current issue. I will request all my viewers to, my audience to look into the current issue. They are so intellectually enriched, so illuminating, and so, I think, challenging. So Litinfinite has this commitment, this intellectual commitment, integrity, and honesty. So it's a long way to go, and I'm sure that Litinfinite will uh, keep on, exploring new horizons.
Thank you so much, sir. This
Thank you.
means a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, thanks to all our audience who were there today. Thanks to Dr. Shomik Sen, our esteemed guest today. We are ending our session. We shall again be back with another guest session, guest talk from Litinfinite Journal. Thank you. Good night,
Thank you.
everyone.